I Never Pissed This Woman Off by Mrballen. What's good? How you day going? Morning, evening, night, whenever you're watching this video. Look, just to go ahead and get them out now before the video get all extra traumatic and shit. It was crazy reading that title as I was looking at the thumbnail because I was like, yo, it looks like she's holding some bills. So this is like, oh. All right, but let's get mature now. With the icebreaker out the way, let's go ahead and find out what pissed this woman off and what extent did she take it to. Yo, if you check out the original video, blah. If you want to check out the original video, link will be in the description below, but let's go.
In early 2014, a sheriff's department in a little town in Oregon conducted a search of a huge 20-acre farm tucked away inside of a forest. A local man had gone missing recently, and this farm was one of the few places they knew he had been. Very quickly into this search, a deputy was walking around the outside of the barn when he saw something strange on the ground. At first, he had no idea what it was, but as he got closer, it became very obvious. Not only would this discovery become front-page news all across the country, but it would also lead investigators to discover something much more sinister going on in that little town. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a cup of coffee, but be sure it's full of coffee grounds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads.
Gotta mute it.
Okay, let's get into today's story.
Gotta mute it, copyright. That one threw me. I actually just got into coffee probably like 2 months ago, if that. Oh, my bad. That'll do, pig.
By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends, she had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality.
She was how old?
Sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in, there was no barn for her animals or tools, there was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the...
Hold on, my bad. Let me get this little one burnt out, but sitting there looking like Fred Flintstone. And it was crazy the entire time as I'm listening to the story. Like, I'm pulled into the story, understanding everything that's going on. But for some reason, even though I feel like I think I know where this is going, at least according to the title and the thumbnail and who I see from the thumbnail. But regardless, though, the entire time I'm sitting here listening to it, I'm picturing like this beautiful looking ass woman who's like smart and intelligent. I just want to go out and be on her own, but away from everyone. Don't get me wrong, I want to be away from people, but not to that extent. I don't want to be that much away. But regardless, though, and then it showed it. I'm like, oh shit, I forgot. But who knows? The story might have a twist.
Of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change.
All right, so we got ads. I got a reason to talk your ear off for a little bit this time. But at this point, I'm not going to lie to you. My mind is definitely kind of straying into a different direction here. I am kind of wondering, though. I'm going to let the video finish, but is someone setting her up, like using this property because they notice it's so large? To do some ish on their own. I don't know. Let's let it finish. We got some pretty long ads here. This one is a minute. I'm about to chill for a minute. I'm gonna let me get this revenue.
On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, hiring these temporary workers at her farm. After they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car pops...
I'm tripping, my bad. This video's called Never Pissed This Woman Off. And like she was being arrested, meaning they gonna do some shit foul, and she about to handle this shit, because you can hear from the story, she not scared of no motherfucking body.
Keyed in on this car.
No more stop.
They pull into her driveway, and then out of the car popped 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman. And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm. And initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much, and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan...
Okay, so I'm not gonna lie. At one point, I was kind of feeling bad because I was blaming those kids. I was like, okay, that's probably the reason why this video is titled that, and we see her on the thumbnail because, hey, these kids are coming to probably do something. Because I was thinking no one knows where she is, so they probably knew since one of them or maybe all of them worked there, and so they tried to do something, but she handled it. So that's where I was thinking it was going. But once we heard the story with these kids that they're looking for their dad, I really believe that they are looking for their dad. Not gonna lie to you, even though the story that was kind of told at the moment, I'm gonna let the video finish. Dog. The story that she told them, it didn't really have a hole in it, but at the same time, I'm like, nah, because we already heard the type of people, black cottonmouth, my bad. But we hear she hired these people who are on a decline in life or ex-con, basically what sounds like people that she feel like, I don't know, that no one would care about, whatever. So maybe no one would come looking for these people, whatever, and some shit probably went sour with this one. I'm gonna let the story finish, whatever, because I don't want to put my foot in my mouth yet. I'm gonna let the story go ahead and finish, though.
Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him.
Damn, my nigga, hold on. I thought that was Robert, man. Go back to
farm. And the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack. He handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, okay, I'll look after your dog. And then Robert nodded his thank you. He turned around and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him, and then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman. That was how he made his living. And so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially murdered someone and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, oh, what about my dad's EBT card? EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's...
And not even being funny, real talk. Okay, this says credit oxygen snap. I think that's from a show. Okay, never mind. I'm about to say, who the hell taking these pictures? Because if she don't like being around nobody, you obviously got somebody around there with a fucking smartphone. Bitch, trudge bull looking motherfucker. Hey, this ain't real photo. You don't like being around people, huh? Oh, shit, man, this is fucked up.
On camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously, this was very suspicious, and right away, the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. Last night, I decided I wanted to treat my family to a nice homemade dessert. And so I headed to the grocery store and I picked up a trough of spoiled milk and a hammock of fermented herring, and then I headed home to blend the two together to create a nice frappe milkshake. But right before I hit blend, I got a notification on my phone that said I had just spent $2,000 on swearatawalrus.com. Now, I love to swear at a walrus as much as the next guy, but that website became so addicting for me. I was swearing at 50 walrus a night, and so I had to cancel that months ago. And so I knew that $2,000 charge could not be mine. Someone had stolen my credit card. But when I pulled out my 20-pound wallet, my credit card was still there. Well, it turns out the Dementor that was at the grocery store with me, who bumped into me as I was scooping up my spoiled milk, he wasn't just bumping into me. He was using his RFID scanner and scanning my wallet through my jeans and ripping off my credit card information. Yes, that's a real thing. People literally can scan your cards with a scanner through your pocket. Needless to say...
Whoa, for real? Damn, that's a good story in itself. Let's talk about this fucking demon. Oh shit, I actually had to rewind this ad.
That was at the grocery store with me, who bumped into me as I was scooping up my spoiled milk. He wasn't just bumping into me. He was using his RFID scanner and scanning my wallet through my jeans and ripping off my credit card information. Yes, that's a real thing. People literally can scan your cards with a scanner through your pocket. Needless to say...
Yo, I got hit for like $550. Like, soon as I got back to Detroit, like, it was probably like 3 or 4 years ago, dog.
Literally can scan your cards with a scanner through your pocket. Needless to say, after I discovered this, I canceled my credit card and I got a Ridge wallet. Ridge wallet has a sleek and durable design. They can hold up to 12 cards, and most importantly, they are built with RFID blocking technology. So if you're like me and you're tired of Dementors stealing your credit card information with RFID scanners, then you need to get a Ridge wallet too. Get the best offer for Ridge with my link, ridge.com/Mrballen, and save up to 40% through December 22nd. Again, that's ridge.com/Mrballen.
Crazy out here.
A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance. And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately. And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, okay, and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you. And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, no, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after. And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card.
So far, I'm not gonna lie to you. because I can only judge off of what I got from 14 minutes in. So far, her story is making sense to me. And like I always tell you, once I get the full story, of course, my opinion will maybe change, whatever. But as of right now,
for his dog that I'm looking after. And since Robert had been gone for
even
all
though
these
I
months,
still
she had
feel
run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card, but Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. And so after several minutes, the sheriff realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, "Has anyone died on your property?" The story that Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across.
Shout out to Explore with us. Let me go back real quick.
That Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away, after that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently.
We got ads here real quick, so I'm just going to talk your ears off just a little bit. But at this point, I'm just wondering, though, once we kick back to the video, is she going to tell another fact or something that's going to make me think, damn it, that sounds good? And again, like I said, yo, you may think these sound like BS when you're here. You may already be calling BS on the story. My bad. Starting up. Yo, just let me finish the story, dog. Or is she just going to, I'm wondering, is she going to be like, yeah, I did it, and just start telling how she did it. Damn,
and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away. After that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen, and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground, as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on, and so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realized they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs, and she begins pulling them aside, and then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back, and his insides had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyways. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Misery. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of murder.
So put him out of his misery, my bad.
went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask. And so he just said, well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe we could have saved him. Or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone? Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream because she sold her pigs' meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth.
Those are not hard to pass.
But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so
I'm not buying this shit no more. All right, at the end, if I'm wrong, I deny. I'll say, hey, I didn't fucking know. I can only judge off what I got. But I'm not buying this shit no more, dog. I'm not lying to you, man. Damn, that nigga big.
The polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn. And so finally, the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm. And if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble because we're going to find it. At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators. And she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. And the investigators are like, who's Stephen? We're talking about Robert. What are you talking about? Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delacino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard, but at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a gun went off. And then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or
hey, shit for the pigs. I don't want no fucking bacon sandwich. Them niggas probably ate more than 2 bodies.
Didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched as Susan's stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. We can only hope they were dead before her pigs began eating them. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen,
I remember that face.
and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains.
What the fuck?
So that's gonna do it.
Nah, bro, boy, I am not working for dog. Let me see. Was this a wig right here? Hold on, cause I don't wear them, so I don't know. I can't tell the difference. So was this a wig, or I thought that was real? Yeah, I'm here for the 7:30. I have to end. Ooh, shit, hold up real quick. I got the wrong address. Definitely rest in peace. And yo, I'm glad these kids actually went out and looked, because I am wondering, like, did any other family come out like, yo, we're missing someone, the last we know is they went and freaking worked here? Because from what we heard from the beginning, it also sound like a lot of these people just went home. I'm wondering, how was their experience with this person? Did anything seem weird for them? Like, yo, when they were around Susan, did they notice anything, or how things were ran? I don't freaking know, man. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get up out of here. And like I said earlier, definitely rest in peace to all those who fell victim to this bullshit. I don't give a damn if they was on a decline in life. Yo, they could have picked themselves up if they were just looking for a job, or really wanted to live here, or just really needed this little getaway to help, whatever. I don't know what the situation was, but definitely want to say rest in peace to them, and definitely to all those families. Definitely wish nothing but peace to y'all. I'm gonna go ahead and get up out of here and enjoy my day. You do the same thing. Enjoy your day, morning, evening, night, whenever you're watching this video. But I'm out.